Okay, let's do this. So very much do not want to do this. 24 slides here. Well, I'll go through them quickly. This is basically all the stuff you need to know from period 9 and maybe even the last chapter of period 8. Um, it's very little of the AP exam. Obviously, very important for contemporary politics, understanding our world. But who cares about that? You just want to get a 5 on the exam, right? So let me go through this. I'll run through some of the election changes. Remember how the Republican and Democratic Party have um, uh, evolved significantly from the 1960s, 1964 election until now. And they'll continue to evolve. Largely, the Democrats just getting beat up on because of, to some degree, their support for civil rights in the 60s, and then also because of demographic shifts uh, among white working class North. So the 60s, it's white Southern voters that abandon the Democrats for the Republicans, and then white Northern working class voters will do the same thing in the 80s. We've gone over, so the book makes a big deal. Here's BG, Barry Goldwater, the architect, the father of kind of a lot of modern neoliberal economic policies. The book has a lot of stuff on conservatism in the 80s, um, which is important, but the bigger political shift is really the most important thing, right? That like the political climate of the United States in the 80s becomes more conservative, largely in response to um, uh, civil rights and the kind of after effects of civil rights. This is a meme I made a few years ago. Uh, Jerry Springer. No, this is not Jerry Springer. This is Maury. As I've said, Barry Goldwater is kind of the real kind of father of modern conservatism. Nixon obviously has a big hand in it. Reagan, who is a saint to many on the right, also introduces religion into the equation, which Goldwater did not. He's not right. He doesn't care about Christianity at all. But as of a few months ago, the president was a Republican, but not conservative, certainly by the standards of Barry Goldwater, Reagan, or Nixon. But let's go back to 1980. The Democrats don't win. They Carter, his home state of Georgia, he wins. Minnesota, traditionally Democrat, also supports the presidential, vice presidential ticket of Carter. Um, what you see in the kind of landslide election of 1980 is the result of conservatives kind of, here I say neo-federalist. You could also say neo-liberal. They've been pushing back against the New Deal and the size of federal government for 25 years. And 1980 is kind of the coup de grace, the big win for them. Ironically, of course, that for LBJ, the thing that undid his presidency was taking money away from social programs, which were going to create uplift, which were going to eliminate poverty, were going to equalize education. He takes money away from those programs, like a demonic suction tube, as King says in one of his speeches, and funnels it towards the war. That's ultimately his downfall. By 1980, that's just like the political platform, right? So that's the whole point: is defund social programs, beef up the military spending, obviously in the Cold War. This is not Eisenhower is kind of an anomaly because the Reaganite neo-federal or neoconservative model is closer to like Hoover or the Republicans of the 1920s than it is Eisenhower's brand. So the 1960s, again, a period of social. It's not a win, right? So this is important that like the fight goes on beyond 1964. It's nice to like stop the clock in 1964 and go, okay, that's it, kids, story's over. But the story isn't over in 1964, 64, 65 into the 70s. A lot of Americans, white Americans, not just in the South but all over, start pushing back against these policies which attempted to do for race and class what the New Deal did for, the size of government, the role of the federal government, and the economy in general. This is a really important way to think about it. I think it's a very, and it's, if you listen to politics, you'll hear this a lot. You don't hear many politicians really talk about citizens as much as they do taxpayers. Everyone's talking about the American taxpayers want this, taxpayers want that. A taxpayer wants to pay low taxes. A citizen in the kind of ancient Greek model or just in a kind of contemporary model, there's different expectations of what a citizen does, right? A citizen is about, Republican virtues of, maybe even sacrifice, self-sacrifice, of penny pinching, of giving, of helping those in need. Taxpayer, not so much, right? So this is a kind of a rhetorical shift that happens along with a very real economic shift. Prop 13 in California kind of initiates, or is the cause of this taxpayer revolt. And again, taxpayers, right? You pay less taxes and you go, well, that's great. I've got more money in my bank account. But where's that money coming from? These were programs that before were helping to eliminate poverty, jobs training, mental health services, you name it. These are programs that benefit poorer Americans. So this is effectively a redistribution of wealth up, right, to the richest Americans. The idea being it'll trickle down, but that doesn't. I mean, the data has not borne that out. It just doesn't. That doesn't happen. But that's the theory. Deregulation, so environmental movement of the 60s and 70s. This is the pushback of deregulation. The environmental regulations are, burdensome, red tape or whatever. So we see that being pushed back against as well. Again, moving towards a model of what does the federal government look like in 1927. That's kind of the direction things get pushed in. Bakke versus UC Regents, kind of a split decision on affirmative action. It says no to quotas, but it can be used as a factor in college admissions, which is good, right? If you want to redress long-standing racial inequalities and make the country a better place to live in, that's a good thing. But people get up on their feelings when they don't get into Berkeley or something, and they want to, they want to say it was, affirmative action or something like that, as opposed to like, I don't know, not paying attention during APUSH lectures. White working class, so the blue collar, right, like this blue collar voter and worker. We see the emergence of Reagan Democrats, right? So people starting to vote for Republicans, even though it kind of doesn't seem like it's in their best interest, because Reagan actually doesn't support unions, and a lot of blue collar workers are in unions. And effectively, what happens is white working class voters start to experience the kind of economic shifts that people of color had experienced in, say, the 70s. So in the 1970s, a lot of black Americans in cities start losing their jobs because the jobs were sent out to the suburbs or maybe even, to another state. By the 1980s, you have those jobs, which are white working class jobs in the suburbs or in those other states, are now going to, Mexico or Taiwan or wherever, right? So and we see a similar demographic kind of grievance happening, say, in the 2016 election. Because the problem as the story goes, the problem is, right, immigrants taking your job, or it's these affirmative action programs which are helping minorities at the expense of white people. It's not true. It's larger economic changes are the reason people get put out of work. But it's a pretty that's a political a form of political rhetoric that has stood the test of time, back to the 1880s and the nativists, as the economy is shifting in the 1870s and 80s. Nativist politicians saying, it's the Chinese immigrant is the reason you're out of a job. So 84 election, again, another landslide, big one. Mondale, who just passed away just recently, just last week. Reagan, really, I mean, this is it. This is like, as you can see from my Street Fighter meme here. Again, to kind of drive this point home, a lot of white working class voters are voting for, in the racist kind of logic of the 1984 election or 1980 election, as the cities are going to hell, right, because of all of these, right. You need to get tougher on crime. We need to stop funding these programs for people of color, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to vote for this guy because he is also against those things. And this is it, like ding, ding, ding. The Democratic Party has been in a kind of glacial retreat since 1968, and this is kind of the like, you're done. Like you guys are done. You got to figure out what you're doing here. Budget hawk. So budget deficit. Everyone, when you're running to be president, you complain about the budget deficit, and then when you become president, well, not so important. You see the U.S. budget deficit by year here, 81 to 2019, in the different presidents, right? So the first 80 to 88 being Reagan, and then George Herbert Walker Bush, and then the Bill Clinton years. You actually get a budget surplus in the 90s. Yeah, sure, Bill Clinton can take credit for that, but one person doesn't do that. It's the tech boom of the 90s, which really sends the budget into the black. A budget deficit, that's the difference between like how much money you are revenue, right, is coming in and how much money you're spending. So the deficit is the difference between the money coming in and the money, well, in this case, the money coming in and the money going out, right? So that's different than, say, like the national debt, right? It's a different concept. It doesn't matter that much, but maybe I'll get into that in a second. So what happens here? We have the kind of formula that we see beginning in the 1980s is big tax cuts, income tax cut, capital gains tax cut. One second here, I'm back. I just had to hand a book to Dr. Contain. It was right here in front of me. So what do capital gains tax, that's the money you make on, say, investments or selling a property as opposed to income. But income taxes are cut, corporate taxes are cut. This, again, tax cuts help people who have a lot of money. They don't help people who benefit from the programs that are being cut, right? So this is a kind of, again, a redistribution of wealth up, but that means less revenue, right? So that when you tax cut, if my taxes are getting cut, it means the government's making less money. Meanwhile, because of the Cold War, you have, right, the defense spending is through the roof, astronomical, which also that costs money. So again, the government is kind of hemorrhaging money here. You create these huge deficits, 200 billion a year. The deficit moves from 900 billion in 1980 to 2.7 trillion. It's a lot of money. Again, these numbers seem trivial almost now when we talk about, 2 trillion here, 2 trillion there because of COVID. Still a lot of money. So how do you fix this problem? Well, you don't, and it doesn't really matter that much, especially, I mean, in contemporary terms, it doesn't really much matter because interest rates are so low that it doesn't really matter. If they went up, it would matter, but they don't. As of now, that's not an issue. Cut social programs. Again, this is a minor fraction of the overall budget. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, SNAP, food stamps, right? Things like that, jobs training. It's like really small, but it is, right? rhetorically, it is a political strategy that works. And when they are cut, it does indeed affect the most vulnerable Americans. Most famously or infamously, perhaps, is the cutting of federally or state funded mental health services. Part of the reason we have a lot of, say homeless or folks with mental health issues is because families don't have the training to deal with these issues. Private institutions are too expensive, so people end up on the street. Not a good look. So what are the Democrats doing this whole time? They're taking notes, man. Um, 84 is a wake up call, right? They lose big time, but they're starting to. It's like a rebuilding year. It's a rebuilding year for the Dems. They start to look at polling data to say, well, who in the heck, who's going to vote for us? It ain't white Southerners anymore. It's not white working class Northerners. So who we got left, right? People of color can't account for all electoral success. So what do? Um, they start focusing on the term in the time was knowledge workers, right? Engineers, tech workers, right? Suburban professionals. These are liberal minded white collar workers. They're cool on the whole race thing. It doesn't really affect them that much, right? Because of geographic segregation. So in theory, that's they don't really care that much. But they think common sense environmental regulation, right? Gender equality is good, better education, and this is the group that's going to be the new base of the Democratic Party. The '84 election and Mondale's use of polling also kind of signals the Democrats' obsession with polling data. Um, uh, and it's not really a good look insofar as like gay marriage, for example. No one was for gay marriage until no Democrat supported gay marriage until it polled at 51%, and then everyone supported it, right? That's not a political position that people are going to get really passionate about, right? So like if you're all in for gay marriage or if you're all in against it, right? You might be on the wrong side of history, but like if you have a conviction, that's what gets people elected. So the obsession with polling is right. Even in the 2016 election, right? The polling numbers say this, the polling says that. Well, polls don't always work out in your favor. So this is again an ongoing uh, crisis for the Democratic Party. But nonetheless, they start shifting towards like if you can't beat them, join them. And they also start saying, yes, we want small government, but the small government response that the Democrats have is these three P's: public, private, partnership. So that is to say, it's not the government that's going to like make a, Tennessee Valley Authority and pump a bunch of money into the economy and build dams and hire people. We're going to get some money and we're going to give it to a private, right, company that's going to build a dam. And this is a public-private partnership. And then they're going to, they get rich. We we give them money, but we get people hired, et cetera, et cetera. And then this kind of rightward shift kind of peaks with the election of Bill Clinton, who is effectively, especially his reelection, just a Republican. If it means getting reelected, he kind of just becomes a Republican, especially with respect to like welfare reform and criminal justice reform. These are things that the Republican Party wants, and in order to get reelected, he supports it. More on Clinton in a second. Okay, so here's your three P's: public-private partnership. Tech sector, went over this already. This is in the 90s. The term was Atari Democrat, right? So the new Democrats are these knowledge workers. Another important rhetorical shift is a shift away from, again, government intervention with three P's, tech sector, things like that. And when you de-emphasize, right, structural solutions, you de-emphasize structural problems, it puts the onus of change on individuals. It doesn't necessarily, I mean, enough individuals, it does work that way. But this notion of personal responsibility, again, changes the onus of the conversation away from we need a big structural solution to a big structural problem. Again, we see this now with COVID, right? That the COVID, right? What the Biden administration wants to do is have big structural solutions to big structural problems. That's a good way to do it if you do it right. It can work. Doing it this way, right? The kind of personal responsibility, it's less effective, but it's also less. There's less on the line, right? In terms of you're a politician running on big structural solutions to big structural problems, and they don't work, you ain't going to get reelected. Where personal responsibility gives you a little more freedom. Defense spending, we don't need to belabor this too much, but you see here where, World War II, Cold War, this is the end of the Cold War. We go, hey, let's, why, we don't need maybe 9/11 happens and the spending goes way, way up again. And that's kind of where we're at. That's a lot of the budget is spent on um, killing people, bombs and things, defending the United States or whatever. But it's way more right than the rest of the world, and that's a lot of the budget. This here you have World War One, then you stop spending money. World War Two, and you stop spending money. Eisenhower gives his military-industrial complex speech, and sorry, Dwight, but it doesn't work out that way. Um, Changing economy. Again, here we have a graph. This is from the Federal Reserve. Real GDP. So this is like how much money the country makes versus real median household income. You see a kind of these numbers historically go up, in tandem. You see a decoupling of that here with a lot of cutting of regulation and things like that. And profits go up, GDP goes up, but household income does not keep up. Again, that is great for GDP. It's not great for the economy insofar as people turn to credit. People turn to home loans and things like that to lessen the gap between the budget deficit, between how much they're making and what they need to spend. More on that in a couple slides. Okay, back to the 80s. Um, you don't you want to beat the Soviets if you're Reagan, but the Soviets are also reforming their system, um, primarily through perestroika, which is restructuring, and then glasnost, which is an openness to the outside world. Um, uh, it doesn't work, right? The state kind of collapses. United States is spending a lot of money to push the Soviets into, competing with the space race and the arms race and things like that. But again, Gorbachev, who is the premier of the Soviet Union, also wants to reform. So it's not just, Reagan gave a speech and then the wall fell down, right? It's not that easy. Meanwhile, don't fund a death squad. If it's called a death squad, you want to not give them money, right? Because they're like called a death squad, and that's bad. But because of the Cold War and not wanting communism to spread, that's what happens. To combat socialism, in some cases, socialism that the majority of voters in a given country actually want. The United States does fund some not so good groups, right-wing paramilitary organizations, right-wing governments, and a lot of genocide happens in Central America. Tens of thousands killed, and it effectively it destabilizes the region. Again, to connect the past to the present, the reason there's a kind of a crush at the southern border of the United States, it's not Mexican migrants coming. It's largely Central American, because Central American countries, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Guatemala, have never really recovered from the kind of chaos and civil war of the 80s and then into the 90s. Very corrupt, gangs run things. Not good. Iran Contra, meanwhile, can't set right. So what is Iran Contra? So Iran is the Iran part, and the Contras are a Nicaraguan paramilitary group. They're contra. They're against the Sandinistas, who are the left-wing group. So we sell arms to Iran. That's not allowed. In order to fund right-wing paramilitary groups, which is also not allowed. But this is maybe like a two wrongs make a right type thing. It is never tied back to Ronald Reagan. Oliver North kind of falls on the sword, as it were. But that's kind of a controversy of the Reagan presidency. Another, a couple hundred American soldiers die in a suicide bombing in Lebanon. That's another big um, uh, problem for the Reagan administration in terms of foreign policy. Problem with domestic policy is the AIDS crisis. HIV/AIDS, Reagan administration is very slow to respond. This is a link to a video maybe we'll watch in class if you can try to remind me of the press secretary under Reagan actually making jokes, anti-gay jokes at a presser. It's a very conservative moment, and people don't want to talk about sex. They especially don't want to talk about gay people having sex, which is the group who are most affected by the AIDS crisis. So other organizations, ACT UP is a civil rights organization. They continue, right, the kind of demands of the civil rights movement, right, with direct action campaigns and things like that, trying to get people to pay attention to a disease that really people don't know how you. I mean, it's incredible to think when you go back to the 80s, people didn't know how you got it, right? Or there was all of these swirling rumors as to you can't shake someone's hand or be in the same room as them or whatever, and all of that stigma was kind of directed at the gay community. So that's a big crisis on Reagan's watch, a domestic crisis. Meanwhile, very briefly, this week we're watching the Grace Lee Boggs documentary. Boggs is from Detroit, Asian American civil rights activist, but largely she is an Asian American civil rights activist. She is not an activist for Asian American civil rights. The contemporary kind of Asian American civil rights movement emerges after the murder of a Detroiter by the name of Vincent Chin. Vincent Chin is Chinese American. He's actually adopted by a Chinese family, and he is murdered the night before his wedding, after he gets in a argument with two white workers who are saying he's Japanese and saying people like him are the reason these two white workers are out of work, and they beat him to death in a very, very terrible way. They don't serve any jail time. I think they pay a $3,000 fine or something like that. And this is a moment in 1982 where we see civil rights movement is not stopped. It's just evolving. The civil rights movement evolves into, right, this notion of to white Americans, we have the same old nativism, the same old xenophobia, but with different inputs in the 1980s. And the murder of Vincent Chin is really seen as kind of the beginning, right, of that moment where a move towards a more pan-ethnic Asian American civil rights. So this is Asian Americans who see common cause with African Americans, who see common cause with different groups, right? Different immigrant communities from South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, to coordinate a kind of broad pan-Asian civil rights movement, which is still ongoing. Again, it's ongoing. All of these things are ongoing. You don't just go, right? It's because of some piece of legislation. Because you can't legislate, right, morality. You can't legislate how people respond, or hearts and minds or what have you, when you have a lot of people who harbor, right, xenophobic or racist beliefs. George Herbert Walker Bush, probably I never liked the term underrated, but he is probably an underrated president. He beats Michael Dukakis in his election. This is the last time a Republican wins a majority in a presidential election, right? That's a long time ago, right? Because you have to remember, Clinton wins next. So, this is 1988. Reagan or Bush wins. Clinton beats him, right? 4 years. Clinton wins re-election, 4 years. George W. Bush does not win a majority vote, right, in the 2000 election, so that's not a majority win. Does win re-election with a majority, right? So there's that. That's the 2004 number. And then we have Obama, and then Trump. God love him. Loses the popular vote not once but twice. So this Herbert Walker is the last time we really get, again, election, not a re-election, but an election win. And he is underrated. Tiananmen Square happens on his watch. Is the kind of revolution that we see in Russia going to spread to China? Nope. Right. So the Chinese Communist Party is taking notes on Glasnost and Perestroika. They don't want to do that. And they kind of effectively shift to a state capitalist, or they had been shifting to a state capitalist regime. Cold War ends and then like nothing blows up. Come on, give my man some credit here. That as a kind of act of statecraft for the Cold War to end, the Soviet Union to fall apart on your watch, and not have some kind of nuclear meltdown or, conflict. I mean, conflict larger than what we saw in, say, Kosovo or something. Invades Panama to remove Noriega because we don't like him anymore. We used to like him, now we don't like him. Invades Iraq. Here's more videos that I can show in class. Does not eliminate Saddam Hussein. I'll leave that to his son. And then he does raise taxes and doesn't win re-election. Okay, there he is. And both the Clinton family. He's a political outsider. Again, more videos we can watch in class. Republicans don't like him, but man, he's a good politician. He is good at it. He's good at talking. He's good at convincing you. People who have met him that I know have said he has a kind of like, he's like a Svengali when he starts talking to you. You kind of like, oh, whatever. Some people just have that kind of magnetism. Bill Clinton has the magnetism. Hillary takes an active role as the first lady, pushes for universal health coverage, doesn't get it. Big economic boom, tech boom, that helps him a lot. Assault weapons ban, 1994. This is a dub for Democrats, right, who want to ban assault weapons. More money for education, that's a win. But, Bill Clinton, when it comes time for re-election, he starts just kind of ventriloquizing some Republican positions, such as lots of money for crime prevention, which we are still living with the legacy of this to some degree. Joe Biden has come out of this fairly unscathed, although Biden was a huge supporter of the tough on crime, mandatory minimums, drug sentencing, beefing up police budgets, etc. 3 strikes, that's a Clinton policy. It accelerates. You look at a graph, right? Prison population way up. North American Free Trade Agreement. That's great if you're a Ford Motor Company and you want to worry about your bottom line, and you want your shareholders to be happy, and you want your stock price to go up, and you want to make a lot of money. Not so great if you're a union worker in like Detroit or Chicago or New Jersey. A lot of those manufacturing jobs get shipped offshore to other places because of things like NAFTA. And people still aren't happy with it. He reforms welfare, which basically is it's a head scratcher. I guess I'm literally scratching my head for the Democrats, right? They've been fighting to increase welfare for 60 years, and Clinton reforms it, effectively taking up, again, Republican talking points to get reelected. He gets impeached. There's a special counsel investigating, all kinds of things, real estate deals, financial transactions. They eventually find that he's having an affair. Brett Kavanaugh, current Supreme Justice, as a young 33-year-old, he is responsible for authoring the most kind of salacious like sex stuff in the Starr report. That is the reason why, when he was kind of like screaming and yelling. His confirmation hearing, he's talking about the Clintons this and the Clintons that. So if you paid attention, you wondered why. It's because of this long-held grudge. He is impeached. He's not convicted, not even close in the Senate. It doesn't work. American public is not on board with this, and the Republicans do pay a price. Clinton's approval ratings go way up. But Gore, his vice president, has a problem on his hands. Do you embrace him? Should he campaign for you? How much should you distance yourself from Clinton? And that indecision, ultimately, it's a very close election. Again, Bush does not win the popular vote, but he just squeaks past in Florida, and you get Bush as president. Um, do I want to stop here? It's been 37 minutes, for crying out loud. I do. I do want to stop here. I don't want to talk about deregulation. Um, I'll talk about it in another lecture, perhaps. But the stuff, it, it gets increasingly or decreasingly important for the AP exam as it becomes increasingly relevant to your life. So there is a kind of ambivalence here moving forward. I'll go over it in another little mini lecture. There's really not that much to it. You know, deregulation, Obama gets elected, or September 11th happens, Obama gets elected, racist stuff happens. That's it. So there you go. I'll record this last lecture at some point in time. But in the meanwhile, hopefully we can make connections to period 8 and then period 9 through the Grace Lee Boggs documentary that we're watching in class this week, the week of April the 26th, 2021.